Okay, so now we get into further trust nomenclature. And this is basically the terminologies and definitions of other positions and other components of the trust. All right, so we have the trust corpus, or sometimes they call the trust res, or sometimes called the trust principal. And this basically refers to all of the combined property put into the trust to give it its value. So if the trust is funded with, say, $2,000 or $250,000, that is the trust principal, or the trust corpus, or the trust res. Situs. Situs is where the property is treated as being located for legal purposes. Now, notice they say treated as being located for legal purposes. So now if you have a trust in New York, but you live in California, okay, and you administer your trust from California, and you put property in your trust, your property may be located in California initially, but it's still, since it's in your trust located in New York, then it is legally, your property is legally sitused in New York, where the trust is. Okay, so the situs is basically where the trust is being administrated from, the laws that the trust is under in terms of its administration and operation. That is the situs where the trust is, regardless to where it may be administrated or some of its property is. Trust certificate. A trust certificate is a paper instrument that represents a share or interest in a trust corpus. All right. Now, TCUs, the trust certificate units, are another level of trust. Generally, with a statutory trust, you would not deal with that. You would only deal with trust certificate units when you have a lot of people exchanging property into the trust. Your trust has a vast amount of money. I mean, with a couple of grand, you won't be dealing in TCUs, not generally, unless you're just doing it for practice. But it is generally for large sums of money, millions of dollars, where you have people who are investing into your trust or exchangers, and you're going to give them instruments representing the amounts or the properties that they put into the trust. These are the trust certificates. But as I said, you generally won't deal with this in a statutory trust or on a trust on basically a novice level. Okay, an exchanger. We already covered that in our graph. An individual that exchanges property into a trust, also called an investor. So your exchangers can also be investors. Protector. Now, protector is very important. However, in a statutory trust, it is really not needed. A protector is when you have a private trust. And when you have a private trust with a lot of assets or a lot of money in it, a lot of property, that's when you'll need a protector. And that is someone who works directly for the grantor and oversees all of the positions in the trust. And they are also the mediator between any two parties in the trust that have a conflict. So for instance, if you have beneficiaries who are questioning the trustee, rather than to approach the trustee directly, they would approach the protector. And then the protector would mediate between the trustee and the beneficiaries in trying to solve the problem. The protector has a lot of power. In some fields, the protector is called a super trustee, because the protector can be given the power to amend the trust, to move the trust, to do a lot of the things basically the grantor could do if the grantor were still in charge of the trust. All right. General manager. A general manager is basically what it says, a manager that supervises trust administration delegated by the first trustee. Now, if the grantor chooses to be the general manager, which he can be, then of course he need not have the delegation of the first trustee. Now, the general manager can act as a trustee but cannot sign banking documents or any documents dictating trust action. Basically, the general manager should not touch any documents that connect the trust to the outside business world. That's a general rule. He can draft them, but he cannot sign them. The trustee's signature must be on all banking and all transactions with regard to the trust in the outside business world. So again, the general manager may draft the paperwork, acting almost like a secretary, but it is the trustee who signs the approvals or who signs the documents for presentations to any agencies outside the trust. Minutes. Minutes are very important documentations of pertinent trust activity, banking decisions, investments, resolutions, etc. And by the way, whenever you make decisions for trust, they should always be in the form of resolutions. So it is resolved that we shall designate trustee Jim Jones as our second signature on our records. Jim Jones, I shouldn't use that name, huh? But anyway, um, the minutes are the notes that you take, the decisions and resolutions of your trust meetings. Whenever your trust makes a move or action that changes its structure, mode of operation, or income in any way, it should be noted in the minutes. Major changes, major adjustments to your trust should always be notated in your minutes. And your minutes are private if you have a private trust. Let me make that clear. If your trust is private, common law, foreign, what have you, your minutes are private and they are not subject to court subpoena, especially if no one knows what your minutes are. All right. Property assets, or property rather. Assets, whether tangible or intangible, owned by someone. Pretty straightforward. Now, property tends to come into the minds of individuals that it is always tangible. That is not the case. Intellectual property, rights, copyrights, plans, blueprints, or even blueprints that are loosely noted, that is all property. Tangible or intangible, doesn't matter. It is all considered property, and intangible property can be placed into a trust just as well as tangible property. Rule against perpetuity. This is a really complex rule to read it, so I have simplified it and as much as possible here. I would encourage you to look at the rule of perpetuities. You can just Google it, rule against perpetuity, and it will come up in Wikipedia, like so. Okay, and you will see a lot of complex, convoluted verbiage and even a chart that attempts to explain what the rule against perpetuity is. Okay, so basically, let's put it this way. Let's use this chart. Let's say you create your trust here, okay, and all of the members of your trust lived along this timeline right here, in between this timeline, in between these two dots, okay. All of the members of your trust passed away, except for your trustee. So you have no more beneficiaries. Now your trustee, the interest of your trust can lapse, or it can go 21 years before one of your descendants picks up that interest. In other words, can now claim ownership of whatever this trust principle is. After 21 years, if no one claims that trust interest, then it's gone. The trust collapses. But if someone picks it up, they can then carry that trust interest and attain and use the property that trust was formed by. Okay. So, trust interest it must vest or convey onto a beneficiary within 21 years of the property of the trust being out of lineal descent. Okay, so lineal descent dictates where that trust property or where that trust interest will go to. So if you have a beneficiary that picks it up 21 years or within 21 years after it falls out of the last beneficiary's control or out of the last beneficiary's ownership, then it does not go against the rule of perpetuity. However, if 22 years after the last beneficiary or after the last owner has that property, if 22 years elapses, then no one else can pick it up, no matter if they are related to you through descendancy or not. Kind of convoluted, but further trust study will pan that out for you. Beneficial interest. Now I have these in orange because they're not really that important for you to understand at this particular point in time, but it's always good to know. Beneficial interest is the right to profits from investments, not principal, which goes to the beneficiaries of a trust. So if your trust has $250,000 in it, and you make a deal that let's say it yields or it nets another $50,000, now you have $300,000. The $250,000 that initially funded that trust is principal. That is not interest. So the $50,000 that $250,000 made or accumulated, that is interest, and that is the interest that can be distributed to your beneficiaries. That is called beneficial interest. Capital interest. This is the interest in the trust corpus and can also represent interest in the profit for the investors or exchangers in the trust. Now this is kind of a favoritism, but capital interest is interest in the trust property and can also be interest in whatever profit the trust makes. So using our previous example of the $250,000 funding the trust and the additional $50,000 being accumulated by investing the $250,000, now we have $300,000. Well, the people certain exchangers who have exchanged property into the trust, they have an interest, so they can reap benefits from the full $300,000 since it was their property that helped to fund the trust with the initial $250,000. Okay, so they get to reap all of the benefit, the interest and the capital, or the initial funding, the initial principal. All right. Trust capital unit. This is a certificate representing share in corpus. Okay. So if you put property into a trust, you're going to get a trust capital unit, which shows what your share is and what you contributed to the trust corpus, or the trust principal, the trust res, what we discussed here initially. Okay. Units of beneficial interest. This is a certificate representing share in profits. Okay, share in profits. The difference here is corpus and profit. Okay, corpus again is the full body of the trust. Profits are the capital raised as a result of investment. Okay, so again, using our analogy of the $250,000, the profits would be only from that $50,000 segment that was made from the investing of the $250,000. All right, so $250,000, you invest that, you make $50,000. The profit margin is $50,000. That is what beneficial interest will yield you. And that means that when you get a unit of beneficial interest, you only have a piece of that $50,000 pie.